The train came in at 2:30, right on schedule, which was the only thing that went right that afternoon in Cartwright Flats, Arizona Territory, October 1883. Holt. Deering stood on the platform with his hat pulled low and his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes fixed on the passenger car door like a man waiting for bad news he had already made peace with. He was 35 years old and built the way men are built who have spent their lives doing physical work without thinking much about it, wide through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with hands that were calloused past the point where the skin registered ordinary damage. He had ridden into Cartwright Flats that morning from the east, which was the direction of Deering Ranch, and he had tied his horse at the station post and bought a cup of coffee from the station house and stood on the platform and waited. He was not there to meet anyone. He was there because 3 weeks ago a letter had arrived at Deering Ranch with a Boston postmark and a woman's careful handwriting on the envelope addressed to Arden Voss, care of his brother. Holt had opened it because Arden had been gone for 4 months by then, and someone had to. The letter was short and had been written with the particular precision of a person who chooses words carefully because she has learned that imprecision is expensive. The woman's name was Vera Sutton. She was coming on the October 14th train. She believed she was coming to be married. Holt had read that letter 4 times standing at the kitchen table, and each time he read it, the feeling in his chest got heavier and harder to name. His brother had done a lot of things over the years that Holt had cleaned up after. Debts in Tucson. A fight in Flagstaff that had required a lawyer. 3 separate occasions on which Arden had promised something to someone and then simply not delivered it, leaving Holt to negotiate the aftermath with the combination of patience and bluntness that was his primary tool for most situations. But this was different. This had a woman's name attached to it and a baby mentioned in the 3rd paragraph and a sentence near the end that said she had sold everything she owned to make this trip. So he was standing on the platform at 2:30 because someone had to be there when the door opened. And that someone, as it had always been, was Holt Deering. The door swung open, and a young woman stepped down onto the platform carrying an infant against her chest with one arm and gripping a worn leather bag with the other. She was perhaps 23, slender, dark-haired, dressed in a traveling coat that had seen considerable use and had been carefully maintained despite it. The infant was small and awake and looking around at the Arizona light with the bewildered concentration of someone encountering that particular quality of sun for the first time. The woman looked around the platform with the controlled assessing expression of a person who had prepared herself for several possibilities and was now running through them methodically. No man waiting with a sign. No welcoming party, no future standing in the dust of Cartwright Flats to receive her. Just the platform and the heat and the sound of the train releasing steam behind her and the ordinary, indifferent activity of a small territorial town going about its afternoon. She took that in. She straightened her spine. The driver of the station wagon was a man named Cutter who had been moving people and luggage around Cartwright Flats for 15 years and had the interpersonal warmth of a fence post in January. He appeared at the woman's elbow without introduction and delivered his information with the efficiency of a man who has said the same thing before and expects to say it again. Arden Voss had left 4 months ago. Arden had owed money to half the territory. He had sold the ranch to cover his debts and headed west toward California. The letters he had written were as far as anyone in Cartwright Flats could determine the product of a man who was exceptionally good at writing letters and considerably less capable at everything else. The woman did not flinch. She did not make a sound. She stood with the baby on her hip while Cutter delivered this information the way a man drops a load of lumber efficiently and without sentiment, and then she said quietly that she understood and she thanked him. Cutter went back to his wagon. The woman stood alone on the platform. The baby started to cry. Holt crossed the platform. He did not rush. He moved the way he moved through most things steadily without wasted motion, the way a man moves when he has learned over many years that most situations do not improve with hurrying, and some situations actively worsen. He stopped a few feet away and took off his hat. He said his name was Holt Deering. He said he was Arden's older brother. Half-brother to be precise, though the word cost him something to say, and he made no effort to conceal that. He said he had known Arden was gone for 4 months, and he had known a woman might be coming, and he was sorry he had not found a better way to warn her before this moment. The woman looked at him. She had dark eyes that were doing what her spine had done 30 seconds earlier, holding their shape under pressure without making a performance of it. She said her name was Vera Sutton. She said the baby was Clara, 8 months old, her sister's daughter. She said her sister's name had been Anne, and Anne's husband had been Douglas Sutton, and they had both died of typhoid fever within 6 weeks of each other in the spring, leaving Clara with no one except Vera. She said this without asking for sympathy, the way a person states facts that have already been fully absorbed and do not require additional processing from the listener. Then she asked him why he was there. He told her the truth. He said he had come to make sure she was not left standing alone on a platform in a town that did not know her with a baby and nowhere to go. He said it was the least he could manage, given what his brother had set in motion. She looked at him for a long moment. The baby had stopped crying and was now examining Holt with the focused, unself-conscious assessment that very young children conduct without awareness that it might be considered rude. She stared at him with complete absorption, one fist in her mouth. Holt said there was a sheriff's office 2 blocks north on the main street. He said if she was willing, he would like her to speak with Sheriff Pruitt before he said anything further. He said Pruitt had known him for 12 years and could tell her what she needed to know about his character, and that if after speaking with Pruitt she wanted nothing more to do with him, he would leave her be and make sure she had sufficient funds to reach the next town. He said he understood she had no reason to trust him and that he was not asking her to. He was asking her to speak with a man who could give her accurate information and let her make her own decision from there. She said that was an unusual way to begin a conversation. He said it was the only way he knew. She picked up her leather bag. His mother, Constance Deering, kept a small house on the eastern edge of Cartwright Flats, a tidy white-painted structure on the corner of 2nd and Maple that she had lived in for 6 years since deciding that the ranch was Holt's and town suited her better in the years she had remaining. Holt passed that house every time he rode in from the east and always noted whether the lamp was lit in the front window, which was how he knew she was home and well without needing to stop every time to verify it. He passed it now with Vera beside him and did not mention it because there were more immediate things to address. They walked 2 blocks north through Cartwright Flats, which was a town of perhaps 300 people arranged along a single main street, the way most Arizona Territory towns were, as though the desert had exhaled once, and this was what settled. The afternoon light was the color of old brass. 3 men outside the hardware store watched them pass. Holt did not look at them. Vera did not look at them either. Sheriff Aldred Pruitt was 55 years old and had the build of a man who had spent decades positioning himself between trouble and the people trouble wanted to reach. He had a gray beard that he kept trimmed and a way of sitting at his desk that suggested he was never quite off duty. He looked up when they came in and recognized Holt with the automatic ease of long acquaintance. He stood. Holt explained the situation in 4 sentences. Pruitt listened without interrupting, which was one of the things that made him effective at his work. When Holt finished, Pruitt looked at Vera for a moment with the assessing calm of a man who has seen enough of human distress to recognize its varieties and respond to each appropriately. He said he was sorry about what had happened with Arden Voss. He said Arden was a man of considerable personal appeal and a persistent inability to follow through on the things his appeal had started, and that the people of Cartwright Flats had learned this lesson more than once at varying costs to themselves. Then Pruitt said, without Holt asking him to, that he had known Holt Deering for 12 years. That in those 12 years, Holt had not once been the subject of a complaint, a dispute, or any matter requiring a sheriff's attention in either a professional or personal capacity. That he was in Pruitt's considered opinion one of the most straightforwardly reliable men in the territory. That if Holt was offering assistance, the offer was genuine, and the assistance would be exactly what it appeared to be, and nothing else. Pruitt said all of this looking at Vera and not at Holt. Vera noticed. She asked Pruitt if he was saying this because Holt had requested him to. Pruitt said he was saying it because it was true, and that if Holt had asked him to say it, he would have told Holt to say it himself. Vera was quiet. Clara made a small sound, and Vera adjusted her automatically, the effortless adjustment of someone for whom that motion had become as instinctive as breathing over the past 6 months. She looked at Holt. She said, "All right." Pruitt brought it up before they left the matter that Holt had intended to raise privately, and so it came out with Vera standing there in the sheriff's office on the afternoon she arrived, which was not the timing Holt would have chosen, but which turned out to be the right timing regardless. 4 days earlier, Garrison Lennox had filed a preliminary claim with the Territorial Land Office on a parcel of land bordering Deering Ranch to the east. The claim was founded on a document bearing Arden Voss's signature, dated in March of 1883. The document was a sale agreement purporting to transfer the eastern parcel of Deering property to the Lennox brothers in exchange for cancellation of a debt Arden had incurred. The problem was that the eastern parcel had never belonged to Arden. It belonged to Holt. The land had been part of Deering Ranch since Holt purchased the property 8 years ago, and Arden had no legal authority to convey it to anyone. But the document existed, and Garrison Lennox had retained a lawyer from Tucson. And until someone formally contested the claim in territorial court, the parcel was in legal dispute. Holt had 60 days before the court would rule in Lennox's favor by default if the claim went uncontested. Vera listened to all of this without interrupting. When Pruitt finished, she looked at Holt and said very quietly that his brother had sold his land before he left. Holt said yes. She said that was a considerable thing to do to a man. He said he had noticed that. She did not say anything further about it in that moment, but she looked at him with a shift in her expression that was not pity and was not sympathy precisely. It was something closer to the recognition one person sometimes extends to another upon discovering that they have been carrying a comparable weight by a different name. The road to Deering Ranch was an hour by wagon cutting west from Cartwright Flats, through scrubland, and across a dry creek bed that ran in the spring and went to sand in October, then up a long gradual rise before the valley opened below. The afternoon had gone gold by the time they crested the rise, and the ranch spread out beneath them with the particular understated quality of things that have been built to last rather than to impress. The house was 3 rooms solid, the logs weathered to silver gray. A barn to the south in sound repair, its roof recently patched. Fencing that had been kept up through the summer, the posts straight and the wire tight. A kitchen garden along the south wall of the house that had been put in properly and attended through the growing season. A large cottonwood by the creek with a rope swing hanging from the lowest branch. The rope weathered but not frayed, the kind of thing that had been put up for someone and kept up after that someone was no longer there to use it. Vera looked at the rope swing. She did not ask about it. Holt showed her the bedroom, the only one. Clean sheets, a real mattress, a washstand with a clean basin, a dresser with 3 drawers. A rocking chair by the window that had not been there 3 days ago and that he had moved in from the main room the morning before he rode to Cartwright Flats, without examining too carefully his reasons for doing so. She said she could not take his room. He said she could, and she would. He said he slept in the barn during the fall season in any case, which was approximately true. He was moving toward the door to retrieve her trunk before she could continue the argument. The first night was simple. Holt made beans and cornbread on the kitchen stove, food he could produce reliably, if not imaginatively. Vera sat at the table and fed Clara from a glass bottle she retrieved from her bag wrapped in cloth. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was itself notable given the circumstances. The wind moved in the cottonwood outside. The lamp on the table burned with a steady yellow light. The desert made the sounds it made at night, which were not loud, but were always present if you had learned to listen for them. Vera asked how long he had had the ranch. He said 8 years. He had bought it from a family returning to the east. The land was good, and the water ran year-round, and the quiet had suited him. She asked if he got lonely. He considered the question with the same directness she had asked it. Then he said that lonely was better than bad company, that he had tried bad company at various points in his life and found it consistently worse than solitude. She said she understood that. Clara had fallen asleep in Vera's lap with the decisive completeness of a baby who has determined that the day is finished and has no interest in further consultation on the matter. Holt looked at the baby and said in the way of a man who is asking something while appearing to be stating something that Vera had mentioned Clara was her sister's daughter. Vera said yes. Her sister's name had been Anne. Anne had married Douglas Sutton, a carpenter from the south end of Boston, a good and steady man, and they had been content together in the way that people are content when they have chosen correctly and know it. Clara was born in February of 1883. Anne died in April of the same year. Douglas followed 6 weeks later, the same fever having made use of the same household. She said all of this plainly, with the measured delivery of someone who has told this story enough times that the raw edges have worn smooth though the shape of the loss underneath remains unchanged. She said she had been working as a seamstress in Boston, earning enough to sustain herself, but not enough to sustain herself and an infant both. She had written to the matrimonial agencies for 3 months before Arden's correspondence found her. His letters had been kind and thoughtful and had described his life with what seemed like genuine honesty. He had written about his ranch and his solitude and the particular quality of Arizona light. He had said Clara would be welcome. He had said he would be glad to raise her as his own. She said the worst part was not that she had been deceived. She had known the risk and come anyway. The worst part was that she had let herself believe the letters, because the alternative was watching Clara go into a Boston orphanage, and she had not been able to make herself do that. Holt set down his fork. He said, that was not poor judgment. He said that was a person making the best available decision with the information she had under conditions that did not permit the luxury of certainty. He said there was a meaningful distinction between being deceived and being foolish, and she had not been the latter. She looked at him across the table. She said he was unexpectedly direct. He said he had never found a use for being otherwise. The days that followed established a rhythm that neither of them planned or discussed, the way functional arrangements between capable people sometimes settle into order before anyone has formally agreed to them. Holt was gone before first light out to check fences and manage cattle and attend to the endless physical maintenance that a working ranch required in the fall. He returned in the early evening with the dust of the day on him and hung his hat on the peg by the door with the same motion every time. Vera cooked. She was a considerably better cook than Holt, which became apparent on the second evening and was not commented upon by either of them. She repaired his shirts, which had needed attention for some time, working with the swift and precise movements of a professional who finds a well-defined task satisfying regardless of its simplicity. She talked to Clara constantly, while she worked a low running account of everything she was doing, as though the baby were a colleague being trained in the full operation of a household and deserved complete information. Holt noticed things about her. He was a man who had spent the better part of 15 years in the company of horses and open country. And that kind of life develops the capacity for patient observation past what most people cultivate. He noticed that she braided her hair loosely on mornings when everything was going smoothly and pulled it back tightly when something was troubling her. He noticed that she read anything available to her, which in his house meant Shakespeare's sonnets and 2 agricultural almanacs and a copy of Pilgrim's Progress that had belonged to his mother and was considerably more worn than the agricultural almanacs. He noticed that when Clara woke in the night, Vera was present before the second sound, moving with the quiet assurance of someone who has long since stopped measuring the cost of interrupted sleep. He noticed on the 5th morning that he had started looking forward to coming home in the evenings. That was something he had not felt in 5 years. He recognized it the way you recognize a voice you have not heard in a long time, with a combination of familiarity and startlement. He pushed it down and rode out to the north pasture and did not examine it directly for the rest of that day. On the 6th morning, he rode into Cartwright Flats to speak with Pruitt about the Lennox situation. The picture assembling itself was not a comfortable one. Garrison Lennox was not a man who waited for legal processes when practical pressure was available, and in Pruitt's assessment, the lawyer from Tucson was theater. The real pressure, when it came, would come from a different direction. Pruitt said to keep his eyes open and his rifle accessible. Holt said he planned to. He rode back to the ranch in the afternoon and found Vera in the kitchen garden with Clara in a basket beside her, pulling the last of the season's tomatoes from the vines before the frost came to finish them. She had her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and there was dirt on her hands, and she was in the middle of a detailed explanation to Clara about the difference between a ripe tomato and an overripe one. She did not hear him approach until he was at the garden fence. She looked up. A strand of hair had worked loose from her braid and was across her cheek. She pushed it back with the back of her wrist. She asked if everything was all right. He said it was fine. He asked if she needed help with the basket. She said she was managing. He went inside and did not pursue what he was feeling any further that evening. That night, he sat in the main room after Vera and Clara had gone to bed and read by the lamp until the oil burned low. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the cottonwood, and the rope swing was turning in the darkness beyond the window, a slow rotation that he could see from where he sat without looking directly at it. He had put that rope swing up in the summer of 1877 for Tobias, who had been 2 years old, and had learned to walk with the furious, single-minded determination of a child who has identified an obstacle between himself and the rest of the world and has decided to eliminate it. James had watched him and laughed. Eleanor had stood in the doorway with her hands on her hips in the posture of pretended exasperation that had never fooled anyone, because Eleanor was not a woman built for exasperation, regardless of how she arranged her face. Holt did not think about James and Eleanor as a deliberate practice. He had learned over 5 years to move around the memory the way you learn to navigate a familiar room in the dark. You know the shape of everything. You know where it is. You do not run into it, but the rope swing turned in the October dark, and he sat with it for a while, letting it be what it was, which was a thing that had been there for a long time, and which he had not taken down because taking it down would have required making a decision he was not ready to make. He was still sitting there when he heard a small sound from the bedroom. Not a cry, not alarm. The quiet sound of something dropped a brief collision with the floor. Then stillness. Then the particular quality of silence that occurs when someone has stopped moving and is hoping the stopping was not noticed. He stood. The bedroom door was open a few inches. The moonlight came through the window at an angle that caught the edge of the dresser, and Vera was standing beside it with something in her hands. And her face in that light was the face of a person who has understood something she was not yet meant to understand and is working out what to do with that understanding. She looked up at him. She was holding a photograph. He knew which one. He had kept it in the third drawer of that dresser for 5 years beneath a folded piece of canvas, and he had taken it out perhaps twice in all that time, both times late at night when the specific weight of certain memories made sleep impossible. Both times he had put it back with care and not taken it out again for a long interval afterward. She turned it to face him, and the moonlight was sufficient to show him what she was seeing. Eleanor in a wedding dress. Arden beside her, younger than Holt could easily reconcile with the man he had known in later years. Tobias between them, 2.5 years old, looking up at his mother with the uncomplicated totality of a child's love, the kind that has no awareness of itself and needs none. She read the words on the back, and he watched the moment they landed. She said the names quietly, as though she needed to hear them in the air to confirm what she was reading. Eleanor. Arden. Tobias. He stood in the doorway. He said, "Sit down. I will tell you everything." She set the photograph down on the dresser, face up very carefully. The way you set down something that belongs to someone else and deserves to be handled with that awareness. She sat in the rocking chair by the window. He pulled the straight-backed chair from the corner and sat across from her and did not light the lamp because the moonlight was enough and because darkness makes certain true things easier to say. He started at the beginning. Arden Voss was his half-brother. Same mother, different fathers. Holt's father had been Robert Deering, a rancher, a steady and unremarkable man in all the ways that steadiness and reliability are unremarkable until they are absent, who had died of a lung sickness when Holt was 10 years old. Constance had remarried 3 years later. The second husband was a man named Silas Voss, who had the particular charm of men who have learned that charm is more efficient than honesty, and who had never seen any reason to develop the latter at the expense of the former. Silas Voss had left when Arden was 4, and Holt was 18, and the leaving had not been a quiet or a simple event. Holt had a scar along his left forearm from the night Silas left that he had never explained to anyone who asked about it. After that, there were 3 of them. Constance, who was practical and clear-eyed, and had the specific resilience of a woman who has survived one significant mistake and is not interested in making another. Holt, who was 18 and already running the ranch, and Arden, who was 4 years old and gap-toothed and had his father's easy manner and none of his father's cruelty, not yet, not at 4. Holt had raised him the way an older brother raises a younger one when there is no other adult available to do it with patience and consistency and the kind of sustained investment that does not announce itself because announcing it would make it contingent on acknowledgement, and Holt had never wanted it to be contingent on anything. He had gotten Arden work on the ranch, taught him to ride and rope and read a contract before signing one, bailed him out of trouble in Tucson twice and in Flagstaff once, and asked nothing in return except that Arden try harder the next time, which Arden always agreed to and then consistently failed to do. For a long time it had worked well enough. Arden was quick and genuinely funny, and people took to him without effort, which is a gift. And also a hazard, because people who are liked instinctively sometimes never have occasion to learn that being liked is not the same as being trustworthy. When Arden was 22, he had met Eleanor Graves at a church social in Cartwright Flats. She was the daughter of a ranching family from the North Valley, dark-haired and capable, and possessed of the specific quality of making everyone around her slightly better without appearing to try. Eleanor had married James, not Arden. Arden had introduced them. Holt said this and let it exist in the room for a moment without elaboration. James was the 3rd of them, Constance's son, by Robert. Deering 4 years younger than Holt. James was the careful one. Methodical, thorough, the kind of man who measured outcomes before committing to actions and was consistent enough in his reliability that people who knew him stopped finding it remarkable, which was perhaps the highest form of that quality. He had built a house on the eastern portion of Deering Ranch with his own hands over 2 summers. He and Eleanor had moved into it in the spring of 1875. Tobias was born the following February. Tobias had been, Holt said, the best thing in any house he had ever been in. He had James's careful way of thinking through problems before speaking, and Eleanor's immediate and unguarded laugh, and a curiosity about the world that was so comprehensive it sometimes seemed like a full-time occupation. He had followed Holt around the ranch from the time he could walk, asking questions about everything he encountered. Why the horses preferred the north pasture in the afternoon. How you could tell which fence post was going to fail before it failed. Where the stars went when it got light. Holt had promised him a horse of his own when he turned 5. He had been teaching him the names of the constellations on clear nights, both of them lying on their backs in the grass outside the barn, looking up at the Arizona sky. The fire happened in September of 1878. Tobias was 2.5 years old. Arden had been drinking. This was not new information and not a surprise. The drinking had been worsening for the better part of 2 years, and Holt had spoken to him about it 3 separate times with decreasing patience, and Arden had acknowledged the problem with apparent sincerity on each occasion, and then continued doing exactly what he had been doing, which was the most reliable pattern Arden had ever established. That September night, James and Eleanor had ridden into Cartwright Flats for supplies and had asked Arden to stay at the house with Tobias. Arden had agreed and had meant it. He was genuinely good with Tobias in the way that charming, unreliable people can be good with children whom they do not feel the need to perform for. When he was sober, he could make Tobias believe the entire world was interesting and nothing in it was frightening. He was not sober that night. The lantern went over in the barn. Whether it was an accident, or whether the sequence of events was more complicated than that Holt had never been able to determine with certainty, and had eventually stopped trying. The barn went up fast. September was dry, and the wood was seasoned, and the hay was summer-cured, and the structure was old enough to burn with conviction. By the time James and Eleanor saw the column of smoke from the road 1/2 mile away and turned their horses and came riding back hard, the barn was fully involved and the fire had reached the south fence line. James went in for the horses. Eleanor went in after him. Tobias was in the house asleep. He did not wake until it was over. Holt was 20 miles north, moving cattle. By the time word reached him and he got his horse under him and rode back, the barn was ash and structural timber, and the smell of it was something he had never been able to find the right category for in the years since. Arden was on his knees in the yard, making a sound that Holt had not known a person could make before that night, and that he had never heard another person make since. James and Eleanor did not come out of the barn. Arden was gone before dawn. He had wrapped Tobias in a blanket, the boy still half asleep and uncomprehending, and put him in the back of a wagon and driven through the dark to the train station at Cartwright Flats. He put Tobias on a train to San Francisco with a letter addressed to Reginald and Dorothea Pemberton, Eleanor's parents, who lived on Pacific Street and had money and connections and a house large enough to absorb one small boy without difficulty. The letter said Arden could not be trusted with the boy. It said Tobias deserved better than what a Voss or a Deering could give him. It said he was sorry. It said he was always sorry. Then Arden had disappeared entirely. Holt had spent the following week reconstructing these events from what people in Cartwright Flats knew and what the station house records showed and what Constance had pieced together. Then he had ridden to San Francisco. The Pembertons had let him in once. He had sat in their front parlor, which was full of heavy dark furniture and the specific smell of a wealthy household, and he had held Tobias for 20 minutes while the boy patted his face with both hands and said his name in the way that 2-year-olds say names, with the vowels extended and all the consonants softened. Then the Pembertons' lawyer had appeared, and Holt had been shown to the door with the firm courtesy of people who have already made a decision and see no purpose in prolonged discussion. The custody hearing was 3 months later. The Pembertons had a San Francisco lawyer and a judge who belonged to the same club as Reginald Pemberton. Holt had a territorial cattle ranch and a half-brother whose name was now associated with the deaths of 2 people and who could not be produced in court to answer for himself because no one knew where he was. The judge had ruled in the Pembertons' favor before Holt had finished his statement. He had not seen Tobias since. That was 5 years ago. The boy would be 8 years old now, almost 9. When Holt finished, Vera was quiet for a long time. She sat in the rocking chair without moving, holding all of what he had said with the same careful steadiness she brought to things that required it. Then she said very quietly, "And Arden sold your land before he left. The eastern parcel. The land where James built his house." Holt said yes. She said that is a great deal for one man to carry alone. He said he had managed. She looked at him in the way she sometimes looked at him when his answers were true, but insufficient, acknowledging the truth and setting the insufficiency aside for a later moment. She asked him directly, did he know who she was when he saw her on the platform? Had he known before that moment? He told her he had not known her name. He had known a woman might be coming because Arden had sent him a letter. But the letter had given no name, no description, nothing specific. He had gone to the platform because it was the right thing to do and because he had spent 5 years watching Arden's consequences distribute themselves among people who had not earned them, and he had reached the limit of his willingness to watch without acting. She asked to see the letter. He had known she would. He had decided somewhere in the middle of telling her everything that he was going to hold nothing back, and this was part of nothing. He went to the main room and opened the second drawer of the writing desk and retrieved the envelope worn at the corners from being handled and put away and handled again. He brought it back and held it out. She took it and read it by the moonlight, slowly reading the way she did everything with full attention and without rushing. Arden's handwriting was unsteady, in places the handwriting of a man who had been drinking when he wrote, and who had also been operating under some condition adjacent to remorse, which for Arden was an unfamiliar enough state that it showed in the penmanship. The letter said he had written to a woman in Boston and given her every reason to believe he intended to follow through. It said he had looked at his own life clearly for perhaps the first time in years and had understood that a good woman and an infant deserved something better than the foundation he was capable of providing. It said he had not been able to bring himself to write to her and tell her not to come. It said if Holt was the man he had always been, Holt would find a way to make sure she was all right. At the bottom, in smaller and somewhat steadier writing, it said, "I know what I have cost you. I know the accounting of it better than you might think. James and Eleanor and Tobias and the 5 years since. I know you have no reason to do this for me. Do it for her anyway. She doesn't deserve what I'm leaving her with. Her name is Vera Sutton, and she is coming in October." Vera folded the letter along its original creases and held it in her lap. After a long time, she said he knew. He knew you would come. Holt said Arden has always known exactly what he is. That has always been the specific difficulty of it. He is not a man without self-knowledge. He simply does not know what to do with what he knows. She looked out the window at the moonlit yard, at the cottonwood and the rope swing turning slowly in the October dark. She said she needed to think. He said that was entirely reasonable. He said the horse would be ready in the morning if she decided she wanted to go into town. Then he went to the main room and sat in the dark and did not sleep. In the morning, when he went toward the barn, Vera was already at the stove. Coffee was made and eggs were in the pan, and she did not look up when he came through the kitchen. He had his coat and his hat, and he stopped in the doorway. She said the coffee was ready. He said he was going to the barn. She said the barn could wait 10 minutes. He hung his coat on the peg. They sat at the table and drank coffee and ate eggs, and Clara sat in the crook of Vera's arm and worked at a wooden spoon with the single-minded concentration of someone who has identified a problem and intends to solve it. Outside, the morning light came in off the desert, clean and cold, the particular light of an October morning in Arizona that has no sentiment in it and no nostalgia, that is simply itself. After a while, Vera said she was not going into town. She said she wanted to be clear that she was making a choice, not accepting a condition. She had skills that would sustain her, and she had enough practical sense to manage on her own if that was what was required. She was staying because she had looked at what he had told her and at what she had seen in the 2 weeks she had been at Deering Ranch, and because the man she saw and the man Arden's letter described were the same man, and she trusted that consistency in a way she had not been able to trust Arden's letters, which described a man who turned out not to exist. She said, "And we are going to address the Lennox situation together." He said she did not need to involve herself in that. She put her coffee cup down and looked at him with the particular patience of a woman who has decided not to argue about something she has already settled. She said, "I am already involved by virtue of living on the property, and you should not take my quiet manner as evidence of a shortage of opinions." He looked at her. He said, "All right." She said, "Good." 3 days after that conversation, Constance Deering rode out from her house on the eastern edge of Cartwright Flats on the gray mare she had been riding for 12 years and tied her at the fence post, and came to the door with the expression of a woman who has already decided the shape of a conversation and is waiting for the other participants to arrive at the same understanding. Holt was out on the north pasture. Vera opened the door. Constance looked at her with the swift, complete assessment of a woman who has spent decades reading people accurately because the alternative has consistently been expensive. Then she said she was Holt's mother and asked whether the coffee was on. Vera said it was. They sat at the kitchen table while Clara pulled herself up on Constance's knee and grabbed at the buttons of her coat with focused enthusiasm. Constance permitted this without comment, watching the baby with the expression of someone to whom babies are not a novelty but remain somehow a reliable pleasure. She did not begin with Holt. She began with Silas Voss, which was where things actually began, if you were going to be honest about causation. She said Silas Voss had been a man of exceptional surface and no depth whatsoever, which she had understood approximately 8 months into their marriage, and which had taken her another 2 years to act upon decisively, those 2 years representing the most instructive period of her life on the subject of the difference between what a person shows and what they are. She said Arden had his father's gift for making people feel well in the short term and his father's complete inability to sustain anything that required effort past the initial appeal. She said Holt had spent 20 years attempting to give Arden something Silas had not, which was a man worth imitating, and that this project had not succeeded and that its failure was not Holt's to carry. Vera listened. Constance said she was not there to persuade Vera of anything specific. She said she had learned from Pruitt that Vera was a woman of independent judgment who would reach her own conclusions regardless of what she was told, and that she respected this sufficiently not to waste either of their time with persuasion. She said she was there because she had wanted to see the woman her son had brought home, and because she had one thing to say that she believed was worth saying directly. She said Holt Deering has been alone for 5 years. Not from lack of alternatives, from the specific damage that comes from losing the people you are responsible for one after another, until the cost of caring about anyone begins to feel like something you cannot continue to afford. She said he does not let people in easily, and when he does not let them go, and the last time he let someone matter, it cost him more than he has ever said to anyone, including me. She said, whatever you decide it cleanly, and say it to him directly, because he has a long history of accepting whatever is handed to him without complaint, and he deserves better than uncertainty about where he stands. Then she finished her coffee, kissed the top of Clara's head with the brisk affection of a woman who does not linger over gestures, and rode back to town. Vera sat at the table for a long time after the sound of the mare's hooves faded. That evening, when Holt came in from the pasture, he found the house swept and supper on the stove, and Vera at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, and his copy of the Arizona Territory land statutes open beside her. She had been reading it and was making notes in the margin of her paper about the relevant sections concerning fraudulent conveyance. He stood in the doorway. She looked up and said she had a question about the original deed language for the eastern parcel and whether he had the documentation to establish continuous possession. He hung up his coat. He sat down. They talked about it for 2 hours, and by the end of that conversation they had identified 3 separate legal arguments against the Lennox claim that Pruitt had not yet raised with the territorial court. The weeks that followed were the closest thing to equilibrium that Holt had known in a long time. He did not use the word peace even in his own thinking because he had learned to be careful with words that described states that could be taken away. But there was a quality to those weeks that he recognized as something he had thought was permanently behind him, a sense of proportion about daily things, a willingness to be present in an ordinary evening without the particular exhaustion of being present alone. Vera was teaching herself to ride on the older mare, patient and systematic in her approach, treating her mistakes as data rather than failures. Holt watched her one afternoon from the fence rail without announcing himself. Watched her working the mare through a careful trot with the focused expression of someone engaged in a problem worth solving, and understood that he had not watched anyone with that quality of attention in 5 years, and that this was on balance information about himself that he should probably take seriously. He rode into Cartwright Flats the following week and placed an order at the general store for a volume of Emily Dickinson's poems, which had to be sent for from Tucson. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon. He left it on the kitchen table without a note or explanation. When he came in that evening, Vera was at the table reading it with the expression of someone who has found something they had not realized they were looking for. She looked up. He said he had noticed she had read his Shakespeare twice. She said she had not had a new book since Boston. He said it was nothing in particular. She said thank you, and the way she said it made it clear she understood it was not nothing in particular, and that she was thanking him for both things at once, the book and the noticing. That evening, Clara said Pa. She said it clearly, sitting in her basket on the kitchen floor, looking directly at Holt with the satisfied expression of a baby who has successfully deployed new vocabulary. It was her first word with any consonants in it. Vera looked at Holt. Holt looked at Clara. He said he was going to check the horses and went out the back door. He stood in the yard in the cooling evening for a while. When he came back in, Vera had set his plate at the table and said nothing about his absence. He sat down. They ate. Clara banged her spoon against the side of her bowl with rhythmic intent, and Vera attempted an expression of exasperation and could not sustain it, which reminded him of someone in a way he allowed himself to notice and then let pass. On a Thursday in early November, Holt rode out before first light to check a section of fence on the north boundary that he had been meaning to get to. He was 2 miles from the ranch house when he smelled it. Not wood smoke from a stove or a campfire. The thick rolling smoke of something structural burning fast and with commitment. He turned the horse and rode hard. He came over the rise and saw the orange light from half a mile out and felt something go through his chest that had no name in any language. He knew the same wordless recognition that had hit him 5 years ago on a different night coming from a different direction toward a different fire. He pushed the horse harder. He came through the gate, and what he found made him pull up for one full second before he was off the horse and moving. The eastern stable, the smaller outbuilding near the fence line, was burning. Not the main barn, not the house. The eastern stable, which stood on the section of land nearest to the parcel Garrison Lennox was claiming. Someone had made a deliberate and specific point. Vera was already there. She had Clara strapped against her back with a blanket tied across her chest in a cross pattern. The baby's face turned sideways and her eyes pressed shut against the light and heat. Vera had the water pump working and was running a bucket line alone, throwing water on the fence posts nearest the stable to stop the fire from reaching the main pasture fence. She was not panicking. She was not making any sound at all except the sound of her boots on the ground and the water hitting wood. She was working methodically the way she did everything, assessing what could be saved and putting her effort there. Holt hit the ground and took the bucket from her and told her to move back. She said she had it. He said the roof was going and she needed to be back now. She looked up, assessed, and moved back. Not because he told her to, because she made the same calculation he had and arrived at the same conclusion. The eastern stable burned to its foundation in just under an hour. The fence posts nearest it were scorched, but the wire held. The main barn was untouched. The house was untouched. Clara, who had been strapped to Vera's back through all of it, had fallen asleep somewhere in the second half of the fire, which said something definitive about Clara's fundamental disposition toward the world. Holt stood in the yard and looked at the embers. Vera stood beside him. She said, "Lennox." He said, "Yes." She said, "This is a warning." He said, "Yes." She said, "What does he think it accomplishes?" Holt said Garrison Lennox was a man who had spent his life establishing facts on the ground before the legal processes caught up with them. He thought a burning outbuilding communicated that the eastern land was already effectively his and that anything Holt built or maintained there was subject to his unilateral decision to unmake it. Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Then we stopped letting him set the terms." He looked at her in the light of the dying fire. She said she would ride to the neighboring ranches in the morning and speak with the families there. She had met 2 of the wives at the general store in Cartwright Flats and knew enough to start a conversation. If Lennox was pushing against Deering Ranch, he was likely pushing against other properties as well, and people who were being pushed separately might be willing to respond together. He said he would come with her. She looked at him and said she knew he would. They rode to 3 neighboring ranches the following morning. By noon, Pruitt had 4 signed statements from neighboring landowners describing pressure from the Lennox brothers over the previous 18 months, 2 of which described explicit threats against property. Pruitt sent a formal request to the Territorial Marshal's office in Tucson before the week was out. It was Vera who found the problem with the sale document 2 weeks later. She had been reading through the copy Pruitt had given them the document Arden had signed, and on her 3rd careful reading, she found a clause in the 4th paragraph that cited a debt origination date of March 4th, 1883. She set the document down and thought about that for a moment. Then she went to the writing desk and found the letter Holt had received from the Flagstaff Sheriff's Office 2 years ago, confirming Arden's drunk and disorderly charge, which Holt had kept because it had required a small payment to settle, and he had kept the documentation of all financial matters as a habit of long standing. The Flagstaff arrest record showed that Arden Voss had been held in the Flagstaff jail from March 2nd through March 9th of 1883. He could not have been in Cartwright Flats incurring a debt to Garrison Lennox on March 4th while he was in a cell in Flagstaff. She put both documents on the kitchen table side by side and called Holt over. He read them both. He looked at her. She said the date is fabricated. He said the entire contract is fraudulent. She said Pruitt needs to see this tonight. They rode to town that evening. Pruitt read both documents 3 times, and then sat back in his chair and expressed himself briefly and forcefully, in terms that he then apologized for, and then used once more under his breath because the situation continued to warrant it. The document was fraudulent on its face. The Territorial Marshal's office, when Pruitt forwarded the materials the following morning, agreed. Holt had 60 days from October to contest the Lennox claim. He now had grounds to do more than contest it. On the ride back to the ranch in the November dark, the air was cold and very clear, and the stars were the enormous Arizona stars that appear when the dry season has taken the last of the moisture out of the air, and there is nothing between you and the sky. They rode without speaking for most of it. When they got back to the ranch, Holt helped Vera down from the saddle, and his hands were at her waist, and she was standing close, and neither of them moved for a moment. The lamplight from the house came through the window and caught the edge of her face in the dark. He said he had something to say. She said she was listening. He said he could not promise that what was ahead of them was simple. The Lennox matter would take months. He was not a man with many words for the things he felt, and he did not expect that to change. He said, "But I have not looked forward to coming home in 5 years, and I have looked forward to it every evening for the past 3 weeks. I know what you came to Arizona for, and I know it was not this, and I know by any reasonable measure it is too soon. But I am choosing you. I want you to understand there is a difference between that and having no other option." She looked at him in the dark. She said, "I know the difference." She said yes. They married on the 14th of November, 1883, exactly 1 month after Vera Sutton had stepped off a train at Cartwright Flats with $3 and an infant and a future that had dissolved before she could put down her bag. The church was small, the first permanent building in Cartwright Flats. Constructed in 1869 by men who believed a town needed a church before it needed most other things. 30 people came. Neighbors, ranchers who had signed Pruitt's statements, a few townspeople drawn by honest curiosity about the woman who had arrived as Arden Voss's mail-order bride and was leaving as Holt Deering's wife. Constance sat in the front pew with Clara in her lap. The baby was wearing a white dress that Constance had produced from somewhere as grandmothers produce things as though they have been quietly preparing for occasions not yet announced. Holt stood at the front of the church in a clean shirt and pressed trousers, and his good boots, his hat held in both hands at his side. He had shaved. He had combed his hair. He looked like a man who had arrived at a decision through careful consideration and was at peace with what the consideration had produced. When Vera came through the door, he looked at her, and nowhere else. She had made the dress herself, working on it in the evenings after Clara was asleep for 2 weeks, a cream-colored wool cut, and assembled with the efficiency of a professional. It was simple and well-constructed, and it suited her in the way that well-made things suit people who value function and have no particular interest in performance. She walked down the aisle alone. She had no one to give her away, and no one she wanted to stand in that role. She walked with the same straight spine she had walked with on the train platform a month ago, at the same unhurried pace, with the same quality of arriving exactly where she had chosen to be. The Reverend Aldous Creed kept the service direct and unadorned, which was appropriate. The vows were the traditional ones. Holt said them in his ordinary voice, quiet and without emphasis, and they carried the particular weight of words spoken by a man who has thought carefully about what he is agreeing to and has no reservations about agreeing to it. He put his grandmother's ring on her finger, a plain gold band worn smooth with years of use. Constance had pressed it into his hand the night before without preamble. When Creed pronounced them husband and wife and said that Holt could kiss his bride, Holt cupped her face in his hands, the rough and careful hands of a man who has spent his life doing physical work and knows precisely how to hold things that matter, and kissed her with deliberateness as though making a promise that extended beyond the language the ceremony had provided. Clara, from Constance's lap in the front pew, said "Pa" clearly and with satisfaction. The 30 people in the church laughed. Holt looked at Clara over Vera's shoulder with an expression that was not quite a smile, but contained everything a smile contains, and then he took his wife's hand, and they walked back down the aisle into the November light. The reception was at the ranch. Neighbors brought food. A man from the North Valley produced a fiddle. Constance had decorated the porch with dried wildflowers she had gathered and bound during the previous week without informing anyone. The tables in the yard were unpretentious, and the food was straightforward, and the fiddle player knew 6 songs and played them all with equal conviction, and it was the best afternoon Holt Deering had spent in longer than he could calculate without effort. He stayed close to Vera throughout. Not from any anxious impulse, but from the simple and somewhat startling fact that he preferred to be wherever she was, which was a preference he had not experienced in 5 years and was not inclined to treat as ordinary. Pruitt found him near the end of the afternoon with the specific expression of a man carrying professional information he would prefer to deliver cleanly. He said the territorial marshal's office in Tucson had responded to the filing. Given the fraud evident in the Lennox document, the marshal's office was treating the matter as land fraud under territorial statute. A marshal would arrive in Cartwright Flats within 30 days to take depositions. The Lennox brothers had been formally notified. Garrison Lennox had retained his Tucson lawyer and made no further moves against Deering property in the week following the notification. Pruitt said men like Garrison Lennox had 2 responses to formal legal scrutiny. They fought harder, or they folded. He would have a better read within 2 weeks. Holt thanked him. Pruitt shook his hand, tipped his hat to Vera across the yard, and went home, after the last guests had gone, and Clara was asleep inside Holt, and Vera sat on the porch in the November dark with the remains of the afternoon around them and the cold coming in off the desert and the stars beginning to show above the ridge to the east. Vera said it had been a good day. Holt said it had been the best day he had had in a long time. She looked at him in the dark. He said he understood that was not the most eloquent observation a man had ever offered on his wedding day, that it sounded like inadequate praise, that there were better ways to put it. She said she thought it was exactly right. She said, "I know what the last 5 years have been. A best day in a long time is not a small thing to say. For some people it is the whole thing." He sat with that. He said, "Yes, you are right." They went inside. The weeks after the wedding were weeks of ordinary life, which from the outside appears unremarkable, and from the inside is precisely what people spend their whole lives attempting to construct and frequently do not know how to value until it is threatened. Holt fixed the north fence line he had been deferring since September. Vera reorganized the kitchen according to a logic that was entirely her own, and that turned out once Holt stopped looking for things where he had previously put them to be significantly more efficient than his previous arrangement. She had begun taking in mending from 2 neighboring ranch families, quiet work she did in the evenings that paid a modest cash income she set aside in the kitchen drawer without comment. Clara was walking now imperfectly, but with complete commitment, launching herself forward on unsteady legs, with the specific confidence of someone who has decided that the method is sound and that the problems are temporary. She fell often and treated the falling as irrelevant, pulling herself upright and proceeding without complaint. Holt had begun reading to her in the evenings. It had not been planned. He had been in the main room with a book one evening, and Clara had pulled herself up on his knee and pointed at the page with the imperious certainty of someone who expects the world to respond to requests communicated through gesture. He had read aloud. She had settled against his arm and listened with the focused calm she never displayed at any other time, and that was how it became a regular thing between them. Vera watched this from the kitchen doorway one evening without saying anything. Later, when Clara was asleep, she said that Clara had not remained voluntarily stationary for more than 4 consecutive minutes since she learned to walk. Holt said she was probably just tired in the evenings. Vera said probably. She was looking at her mending and not at him, but he could hear something in her voice that he did not examine too closely because he was not ready yet to put language to what it indicated about his own situation. December came in cold and stayed cold, and the rhythm of the ranch and the household continued to deepen into something that felt, without announcement, permanent. Holt was fixing the east fence one afternoon in the first week of December when he heard Vera laugh from inside the house, a genuine and unguarded laugh at something Clara had done, and he stood holding his fence tool for a moment, listening to the sound of it carry across the cold yard. He put the fence tool down and looked at the mountains to the north. He had been a man who lived alone for 5 years and had made his peace with that, or believed he had, which he understood now were not the same thing. That evening after supper, when Clara was asleep, he and Vera sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and she was reading her Dickinson, and he was supposed to be reviewing the paperwork Pruitt had sent out regarding the marshal's upcoming deposition process, and he set the papers down. He said, "I want to say something." She looked up from her book. He said he understood that she had come to Arizona for specific reasons that had nothing to do with him, and that what had happened since her arrival had not been what either of them planned, and that he was not a man who assumed that because something had developed a particular shape, it was therefore what the other person wanted it to be. He said he wanted to ask her directly whether she was content, not whether she was managing, whether she was content. She looked at him across the lamp for a moment. She said, "I am more than content. I want you to know that, without any uncertainty. I did not expect this. I did not come to Arizona expecting anything like this. But I am not the kind of person who fails to recognize a good thing because it arrived differently than anticipated." She said, "Are you content?" He said, "I'm more than content. I want you to know that too." She nodded once and looked back at her book. He looked back at his papers. The lamp burned between them, and outside the December wind moved through the cottonwood, and the ranch was quiet around them. It was 2 weeks before Christmas, on a morning when the temperature had dropped sharply overnight, and the ground was iron hard, and the sky was the pale, faded blue of deep winter, that Vera came in from the kitchen garden, where she had been checking the root vegetables, and stood in the kitchen doorway without taking off her coat. Holt was at the table with his coffee. He looked at her. She said, "I think I am going to have a baby." He set his cup down. She said she was not certain yet, but she was certain enough. She said she thought the timing suggested the baby would arrive in September, which gave them a good while to prepare. Holt looked at the table. He looked at her. He stood up and crossed the kitchen, and he put both arms around her in the coat she was still wearing, without saying anything, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the kitchen in the cold morning light for a long time. He said into her hair, "James, if it is a boy." She said, "After your brother." He said, "Yes." She said, "James Tobias Deering. Tobias for your nephew. So they are connected from the beginning." He pulled back and looked at her. She said, "So that when Tobias comes, and he will come, he knows this baby carries his name. He knows he is family without any ambiguity about it." He looked at her face in the winter light. He thought about the way she said things, the way she went directly to the center of what mattered, without any of the circumlocution that most people use to approach difficult or important things. He said, "That is exactly right." She said, "Good. Now sit down and finish your coffee. You have the marshal coming in 6 weeks, and the north pasture fence still needs 2 more posts before the ground freezes solid." He sat down. He drank his coffee. He was smiling, which was not something his face did with particular frequency, and which, when it did, changed his appearance considerably. Vera saw it and looked back at the stove, and also smiled at the stove where he could not see it. The territorial marshal, a thorough and unhurried man named Cordell, arrived in Cartwright Flats in the 2nd week of February, 1884. He spent 4 days taking depositions and examining documents and interviewing the Lennox brothers' lawyer, who had arrived from Tucson in expensive clothes and departed 4 days later in the same clothes but with a considerably less confident expression. Cordell examined the fraudulent sale document and the Flagstaff jail records with the focused attention of a man who has processed many fraudulent land documents and knows precisely what he's looking at. He left on a Friday with a case file that Pruitt described as unusually clean, meaning that the fraud was unusually apparent and unusually well documented. The territorial court ruling came in late March on a cold and bright morning. Pruitt rode out to the ranch with the paperwork and handed it to Holt from his saddle. The court had found the sale document fraudulent. The claim on the eastern parcel was dismissed in its entirety. Garrison Lennox had been charged with land fraud under territorial statute. The arson matter had been referred to the territorial prosecutor. The eastern parcel remained part of Deering Ranch, as it had always been, as James had built a house on it and as Holt had maintained and worked it for 8 years. Holt read the document. He handed it to Vera. She read it. She handed it back. He looked at the document in his hands, and then at the eastern pasture and the house James had built, which he had repaired and maintained every year since 1878, because it was there and because some things you do not allow to fall into ruin. He said, "It is over." Vera said, "It is over." Pruitt tipped his hat and rode back to town. Holt put the document inside his coat and stood in the yard in the March light for a moment. Then he went back to work, because there was always work, and because work was how he processed things that were too large for sitting still. The following day, a letter arrived from San Francisco. Holt saw the return address before anything else. Reginald Pemberton, Pacific Street, San Francisco, California. He stood in the yard with the letter in his hand for a long time before he went inside. Vera saw his face when he came through the door. She set down what she was doing and waited. He put the letter on the kitchen table and sat down. She sat across from him. He said it was from Tobias's grandfather. She said, "Do you want to read it alone?" He said no. He opened it. Reginald Pemberton wrote in the careful, deliberate script of a man who has composed a letter many times in his head before committing it to paper and who has in the process removed everything unnecessary. The letter was 3 pages. Holt read it through once in silence, then set it on the table and looked at the window and then picked it up and read it again. He handed it to Vera without speaking. She read it carefully. Reginald Pemberton wrote that Tobias was 8 years old and would turn 9 in February. He wrote that the boy was healthy and bright and had his mother's eyes and his father's habit of thinking through problems thoroughly before speaking, which Reginald noted with the particular tone of a man who had found this quality easier to appreciate in a grandson than he had managed to in a son-in-law. He wrote that for the past year Tobias had been asking about his Uncle Holt with increasing specificity. Not general questions, specific ones. Whether Holt still had the ranch, whether the cottonwood by the creek was still standing, whether Holt still had the bay horse that Tobias had been allowed to sit on when he was not yet 3, which Tobias remembered with a clarity that his grandparents found surprising given how young he had been. Reginald wrote that he and Dorothea had done Holt a serious wrong and that he intended to say so without qualification or mitigation. They had been destroyed by grief and had directed that grief at the nearest available target, which was the Deering name and anyone who carried it. They had known at the time that this was not just. They had done it anyway because grief in its acute form is not a reasonable condition, and they had not been reasonable people in the 2 years following Eleanor's death. He wrote that they were asking if Holt was willing to bring Tobias to Arizona for a visit. They would understand if the answer was no and would not press if Holt preferred to leave the situation as it had been. But Tobias deserved to know his family, and continuing to deny him that relationship because of the failures of adults he had no part in was something they were no longer willing to do. The letter ended, "Your brother cost us Eleanor. You have carried that weight every day since, though you had no part in causing it. We understand that now. We are sorry it took us 5 years to be capable of saying it to you directly." Vera set the letter down. She waited. Holt sat very still at the kitchen table. Outside, the March wind moved through the cottonwood. Clara was in the next room, audible in the midday quiet. After a long time, he said he asks about the bay horse. Vera said he was not yet 3 and he remembered. Holt said the bay horse died in 1880. He stopped. Vera said we will find another bay horse before he comes. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted in a way it did not usually shift, something that had been held in a fixed position for a very long time, beginning to move. He said, 5 years. She said, I know. He said, I have thought about him every day for 5 years. Every single day. She said, Holt. He stood up from the table and went out the back door. She heard his footsteps cross the yard. She heard the barn door. She let him go. She sat at the table and looked at the letter and looked at Clara playing on the floor and thought about men who hold things together for so long that they forget they are allowed to put them down, and about what it looks like when someone finally remembers. After 40 minutes, she went to the barn. He was on the hay bale in the corner, the one he used when he needed to think what she had figured out in the first week. He was not crying. He was somewhere past or before, tears in the place where things are simply true and there is nothing yet to be done with their truth, except to hold it. She sat down beside him on the hay bale. Their shoulders touched. Neither of them said anything. After a while he said, I need to write back tonight. She said, "I will get the paper." He said, "I do not know how to begin it." She said, "Begin with yes. Tell them you will have his room ready. Tell them you want him to come. Everything else can be said in person." He looked at her. He said, "You are going to be very good at this." She said, "I have been practicing on you." He almost smiled. She saw it. They went inside and he wrote the letter at the kitchen table while she made supper. And she did not look over his shoulder, and he did not ask her to. When he finished, he read it once, folded it, sealed it, and put it by the door to go to town in the morning. Then they ate, and she did not ask how he felt, and he did not tell her. And both of these things were the right thing. Tobias. Deering arrived in Cartwright Flats on the 3rd of April, 1884, on the afternoon train accompanied by Reginald and Dorothea Pemberton. Holt was on the platform. He had been there for 45 minutes before the train was due, which was not something he would have acknowledged if asked. He had told Vera he needed to pick up a supply order from the general store, which was also true, and had accomplished that errand in 8 minutes and then gone to the platform and stood there with his hat in his hands in the April sun. Vera stood beside him a few steps to his left with Clara on her hip. She had positioned herself there deliberately present but not forward, because she understood without being told that this moment was Holt's and that her role was to be there when he needed her and to stay out of the way until that time arrived. The train came in at 2:30. The door opened. Reginald Pemberton descended first, moving with the careful dignity of a man in his late 60s who has learned to negotiate steps without appearing to negotiate them. He was older than Holt remembered, from the one time he had been allowed into that San Francisco parlor, grayer and somewhat diminished in the way that grief and time diminish people who do not have an alternative. Dorothea followed a small woman in a gray traveling coat, her face composed with the specific composure of someone for whom composure is a practiced discipline rather than a natural condition. Then Tobias came through the door. He was 8 years old, tall for his age, with dark hair that wanted to go in several directions at once, and Eleanor's gray-green eyes, and the specific way of looking at things that James had had careful and assessing as though he was filing information before he formed a conclusion. He came through the door with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who has not yet learned to doubt his right to occupy the space he occupies, and he stepped onto the platform and looked around. He found Holt. He stopped. He looked at Holt with those careful, filing eyes for a long moment. Then he said, "You are taller than I thought you would be." Holt said, "You are taller than I thought you would be too." Tobias said, "I do not remember what you look like, but I remember your voice. You used to read me the story about the wild horse that learned to trust the rancher. You read it so many times I used to say the words with you even though I could not read yet." Holt said, "I still have that book." Tobias said, "I know. I asked grandfather to write and confirm you still had it before we came. I wanted to make sure." He crossed the platform with the directness of a child who has decided what he is going to do and has no reason to delay doing it. He walked up to Holt and stopped in front of him, looked up, and then put his arms around Holt's waist and pressed his face against his coat and held on with the particular grip of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific thing and is not going to do it halfway now that it has arrived. Holt put his hand on the back of the boy's head. He looked at nothing in particular. He said nothing at all. Vera looked at the mountains above Cartwright Flats, the pale blue ridgeline against the April sky, and blinked several times, and adjusted Clara on her hip. Reginald Pemberton walked up beside her. He was quiet for a moment, watching his grandson hold on to his uncle with the focused attention of a man watching something he has caused, and is still determining how to feel about having caused it. Then he said without preface, in the voice of a man who has practiced saying a difficult thing until it came out clean, "We punished him for ardent sin. For 5 years we punished a man who had no part in what happened and who wanted nothing except to be allowed to know his nephew. That was wrong. I am saying it to you now because I should have said it to him 5 years ago and did not, and because I understand that you are the person who knows him now, and who will be there when I say it to him directly. And I want you to know it is true. Vera said he will hear it from you. That is what matters now." Reginald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does he know? What he has with you and that child, does he understand what that is?" Vera looked at Holt, still standing on the platform with his hand on Tobias's head and his eyes closed against the April light. She said, "I think he is beginning to—" Tobias finally let go, stepped back and looked at Holt with a practical expression. He said he was ready to see the ranch whenever Holt was ready to take them. Holt said the wagon was just there. They went. The Pembertons stayed for 2 weeks, which was longer than the original letter had indicated, and which had come about because on the 3rd day, Tobias had informed his grandparents that 2 weeks was not sufficient and that he required at minimum another 7 days. And because Reginald Pemberton, who was a man accustomed to making decisions based on clear evidence, had looked at his grandson's face and agreed. Dorothea warmed faster than her husband, which Vera had anticipated. She had the grandmother's instinct for Clara and was on the floor with the baby within the first hour, and Clara, who had never in her 14 months of life met a stranger she was not prepared to immediately recruit, took to her completely. Reginald sat across from Holt at the dinner table on the first evening with the positioning of a man who has a specific thing to say and is identifying the right moment. He said it on the second evening when Vera and Dorothea were in the kitchen and Tobias had gone to bed. He looked at Holt and said what he had said to Vera at the train station. He said it plainly without ornamentation in the direct manner of a man who has decided that plain is the only register appropriate to the thing being said. Holt listened. He said, "I know why you did it. I knew at the time. Eleanor was your daughter and James was my brother, and neither of us could hold that grief in a rational way in those first years." Reginald said knowing why does not make it right. Holt said no, but it makes it possible to move forward from, and moving forward is what matters now. For Tobias. Reginald looked at him. He said Eleanor always said you were the steady one, that James had the good fortune of being loved by the brother worth knowing. Holt looked at the table. He said she was a good woman. Reginald said she was. And that boy in there has her best qualities and his father's steadiness, and he's been asking about you for over a year. Whatever else happened, Holt, he knows you are his family. He has always known. Tobias spent his days at the ranch the way he approached everything methodically and with comprehensive questions. He wanted the name of every horse. He wanted to understand how you evaluated fence integrity by visual inspection before a post failed. He wanted to know which direction the mountains were and how far it was and whether you could ride to them in a day. On the 4th day, Holt saddled the steady brown mare for him and they rode the east fence line for 2 hours, with Tobias asking and Holt answering in the patient and complete manner he had used when reading to the boy 7 years ago, when Tobias had been 2 years old and asking different questions with the same quality of attention. Tobias said at some point in the 2nd hour, without special emphasis, "Are you going to be sad when I have to go back?" Holt said yes. Tobias said, "I am going to be sad too, but grandfather said I can come in the summer, a full month." Holt said a full month. Tobias said, "I want to learn to rope properly before then. I have been practicing on a post in the yard at home. Grandfather says I am showing improvement. I think he is being polite, but I am actually improving." Holt said, "Your grandfather is a good man who has spent a great deal of time in San Francisco." Tobias laughed. It was James's laugh, exactly quick and genuine and without any performance in it, and it hit Holt in the chest with a precision that left him momentarily without anything to say. They rode back in the afternoon light, and Vera had coffee on, and Constance had appeared from somewhere with a dried apple pie, which she did periodically, and without explanation, as though she operated on a schedule she had not shared with the household. On the evening before the Pembertons were to leave after Tobias was in bed, Holt and Vera sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the house quiet around them. Vera said, "He asked me today whether I was nice to you." Holt said, "What did you say?" She said, I said I tried to be." He said, "Good." He said, "You deserve it." Holt looked at the table. Vera said, "He is going to be fine. He has been fine. The Pembertons have done right by him in the ways that matter even when they did wrong by you. He is a good boy, Holt. He is James's son, and he is going to be fine." Holt said, "And in the summer he will be here for a month." She said, "And we can ride to the mountains and see how far it is." He said, "It is about a day and a half." She said, "I looked it up." He looked at her. She said we could all go. You and me and Clara and Tobias and whoever else might be part of this family by June. He put his hand over hers on the table. He said, "Yes, we will go." The Pembertons left the following morning. Tobias held on to Holt on the platform for a long time. When he let go, he stood straight and said he would write every week without fail. Holt said he would write back every week. Tobias said his grandfather would probably limit him to 1 letter a week regardless. Holt said that was probably wise. Tobias said he did not think it was wise, but he would comply. The train took them north and west, and they were gone. Holt stood on the platform until the train was out of sight. Then he stood there a while longer. Vera stood beside him. After a while, he said 4 months until summer. She said, "We will fill them." They went home. May arrived with heat and the particular quality of Arizona spring that is not the gentle spring of the eastern states, but is its own thing, bright and dry and smelling of dust and sage and the specific wildflowers that bloom briefly in the desert before the true summer heat arrives and ends them. The kitchen garden was in. The north pasture fence was complete. The new stable on the eastern section stood white and solid where the old one had burned. Vera was 7 months along by May and showed it and had declined with characteristic directness all suggestions from Constance that she should be doing less than she was doing. She said she was not ill, she was pregnant, and that the distinction was meaningful. Constance said she was not suggesting Vera was ill, she was suggesting she was carrying a significant amount of extra weight while performing the full duties of a working ranch household and that some moderation was reasonable. Vera said she would take the suggestion under consideration. She then went back to what she had been doing. Holt stayed close to the ranch in those months in a way he had not arranged consciously, but that Vera noticed and did not comment on. He found reasons to work the near pastures rather than the distant ones. He came in earlier in the evenings. He was present in the way that men who have spent their lives in physical work are present not through conversation or overt attention, but through proximity and a steady awareness that communicated itself without being stated. One evening in June, he came into the kitchen and found Vera reading Tobias's most recent letter, which had arrived that afternoon at the kitchen table with a particular expression on her face that was satisfaction and something that was not quite sadness, but was adjacent to it. He sat down. She handed him the letter. Tobias wrote that he was continuing to practice roping and that he had now successfully roped the fence post 12 times in a row, which he acknowledged was not the same as roping a moving animal, but which he felt was a legitimate preliminary milestone. He wrote that grandfather had hired a man to teach him to ride more formally, which Tobias said was inferior to learning from Holt because the hired man did not explain the reasons behind things the way Holt did when they had ridden the fence line in April. He wrote that grandmother had been teaching him to play the piano, which he said he was willing to learn, but which he hoped would not consume the entire summer visit because he had a specific list of things he needed Holt to teach him, and he had calculated that 4 weeks was only sufficient if they used the time efficiently. At the bottom, he had written, "I told everyone at school that my uncle is a rancher in Arizona and that he has been teaching me everything since I was small. My teacher asked if that was accurate since I have not seen my uncle in 5 years. I told her it was accurate because some things are true even when the circumstances do not allow them to be visible for a while. She said that was a sophisticated thought for my age. I said I had been thinking about it for a long time." Holt read the letter twice. He set it down. He said he sounds like James. Vera said he sounds like himself, which is also like James. And a little like you. Holt looked at her. She said the way he explains his reasoning before he states his conclusion. The way he does not assume the other person will understand without the supporting information, that is you. He said he had not noticed that. She said he has been paying attention to you his whole life, even when he could not see you. Children do that. They carry the people who mattered to them. He folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. He said we should write back tonight. She said yes. The letter they wrote that evening was longer than usual. 3 full pages with Holt writing most of it and Vera adding a paragraph at the end about the kitchen garden and Clara's recent discovery that she could climb the fence rail if she approached it with sufficient determination, and a note at the very bottom in Clara's involuntary contribution to correspondence, which was a small handprint in ink that Vera had pressed to the paper when Clara grabbed the pen and then redirected. They posted it the following morning, and it reached San Francisco 8 days later, and Tobias wrote back within 2 days of receiving it, which was the fastest turnaround they had yet achieved, and which Tobias noted in his reply was because some letters required immediate response, and the handprint from Clara was one of those. James Tobias. Deering was born on the 28th of August, 1884, in the bedroom at Deering Ranch, in the room where Vera had slept on her first night at the ranch, 18 months before, arrived into the particular quality of late August light in Arizona, which is gold and abundant and has a weight to it that the spring and fall light do not, as though the summer has concentrated everything it has into these last weeks before the season turns. Constance was there. She had arrived 2 weeks before the expected date and had established herself in the household with the calm authority of a woman who has attended enough births to know that the time to arrive is before you are needed rather than after. She had made this point to Holt, who had agreed, and had made it to Vera, who had also agreed, and that was the end of the discussion. Holt was there throughout. Constance had made 2 attempts to redirect him to the main room, and on the 3rd attempt, Vera had said between contractions that she would have significant words for Constance about this at a later time, and Constance had looked at her daughter-in-law with an expression that contained something close to pride and gone to put more water on. The boy arrived just before sundown. He was healthy and vocal and had Holt's jaw and Vera's eyes and an immediate and comprehensive opinion about the world that he communicated without reservation from the first moment. Holt held him. He sat in the rocking chair that had been in this room since the first night Vera arrived. The chair he had moved from the main room because something had told him to, and he held his son in the last of the august light coming through the window and looked at the boy's face. He said, "James Tobias Deering." "Welcome home," Vera said from the bed with the particular voice of a woman who has just done something significant and is conserving her resources. "He has your jaw." Holt said he has his own face. She said yes. "That too." Constance appeared in the doorway, assessed the scene with one practiced look, said nothing, and went to make coffee. Clara, awakened from her nap by the general disruption, toddled into the room and stood in the middle of it and looked at the baby in Holt's arms with the focused, evaluative expression of a 20-month-old conducting a serious assessment of a new development in her environment. Then she crossed to Holt's chair and put both hands on his knee and looked at the baby from close range. She said, "Baby." Holt said yes. She patted the baby's blanket once carefully and then went back to the main room where her toys were having apparently completed her assessment and filed her conclusion. Vera laughed. It was the laugh that Holt had heard for the first time 3 weeks after her arrival, the unguarded one, the one she produced when she was not managing anything. He looked at her across the room. He said, "Thank you." She said, "For what specifically?" He said, "For all of it. For staying. For this. For James Tobias. For the past year." She said, "Thank you for being in the right place at the right time and for being exactly who you are and not something easier to trust." He said, "That is an unusual compliment." She said, "I mean it as the highest one I know." Constance returned with coffee and the information that the neighbor's boy had already ridden to town with the news and that there would likely be visitors the following day, and that she intended to stay for 2 weeks to make sure everything was properly established, and that she expected no argument about this from either of them. Neither of them argued. A letter arrived from San Francisco 12 days later, in response to the telegram Holt had sent the morning after James Tobias was born. It was from Tobias, who had turned 9 in February, and who wrote at the top of his letter that he had been waiting for news since Holt's telegram, and had read the letter 3 times. He wrote that James was a very good name, and that he understood why Holt had chosen it. He wrote that his teacher had explained to him what it meant to name someone after a person who had died, that it was a way of saying the person was not forgotten, and that what they had been and what they had meant continued to exist in the world. He wrote that he thought his father would have liked that very much. He wrote that he had told everyone at school that he had a cousin named after his father, and that the cousin also carried his own name, which meant they were connected in a way that would always be true. He wrote that his grandmother Dorothea had cried when she read Holt's telegram, which Tobias noted was the first time in his memory that she had cried in front of him, and that he thought it was a good kind of crying. He wrote, "I have been thinking about something my teacher said. She said the people who matter to us most are the ones who show up, not just once, consistently. She was talking about something else, but I thought about you. You showed up on the platform the day Aunt Vera arrived. You show up every time you write. You showed up in April. You will show up in the summer. I think that is what family is. Not just the people you share blood with, the people who show up. I will see you in June. Please save the horse story. I want to hear you read it to James when he is old enough, and I want to be there when you do. Tobias." Holt read the letter at the kitchen table on a September morning with the window open and the early fall air coming in clean and the baby in the cradle by the window and Clara on the floor negotiating a complex arrangement of wooden blocks and Vera at the stove with her back to him and the ordinary sounds of the household around him. He read it twice. He set it down. He sat for a moment with the specific quality of stillness that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from having too much of it to move through quickly. Then he went to the writing desk and opened the third drawer and took out the photograph of Eleanor and Arden and Tobias. He looked at it for a moment in the September light. Eleanor in her wedding dress, Arden younger than memory, Tobias between them not yet 3 looking up at his mother. He carried the photograph to the dresser in the bedroom and set it on top face up in the light. Then he went back to the writing desk and took out Arden's letter, worn along the fold lines, and the Flagstaff jail record that had broken the Lennox claim and the court document dismissing that claim, and he put them in the third drawer together, in the place where the photograph had been. He closed the drawer. He went to the kitchen and poured himself coffee and sat at the table, and Vera set a plate in front of him without being asked, the way people do things in households where they have learned each other thoroughly enough that the learning no longer requires announcement. Clara knocked over her block arrangement and said something in the comprehensive and emphatic language of almost 2-year-olds that conveyed strong feelings about the structural failure she had just experienced. James Tobias. Deering slept in his cradle in the morning light with his small fists closed and his face arranged in the satisfied expression of someone who has arrived in a place and found it exactly sufficient. Outside, the cottonwood had gone to its first October gold earlier than usual. The leaves turning in the morning light, the color of the thing itself rather than a symbol of it. The rope swing turned in the light wind. The new stable stood solid on the eastern section. The mountains to the north were the color of distance blue and patient and unchanged by any of it, which was their nature and their quality, and which Holt had always found more comforting than not. He drank his coffee. Vera sat down across from him with her own cup. She said, "What are you thinking about?" He said, "June." She said, 4 months. He said, "Tobias wants to be there when I read James the horse story." She looked at him. He said, "I told him I would wait." She said, "That is a promise you will keep for years." James will not be ready for that story for at least 3 years. He said, "Tobias can come back every summer." She said, "Yes, he can." They sat at the kitchen table in the morning light with the coffee between them and the baby in his cradle and Clara rebuilding her blocks with renewed determination and the ranch around them and the mountains beyond the ranch and the long clear Arizona sky above all of it. Holt. Deering had stood alone on a train platform 13 months ago because it was the right thing to do, not knowing what would follow from it, only knowing that someone had to be there and that he was the someone available. He had not been looking for anything. He had not believed at 35 years old, with 5 years of deliberate solitude behind him, that what followed from a single act of simple decency could be this. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong in the best way a man can be, wrong which is to have his understanding of what is possible enlarged past what he had concluded was his limit. The man who had stood alone on the platform sat at his kitchen table in the house he had kept for 9 years and drank his coffee and looked across at his wife and listened to his daughter rebuild her towers and to his son breathe in his cradle, and was home in all the ways that word can mean in every one of them at once.